So I'm here at Last Dual Park in Perth, Ontario, Canada. The road up there is all under construction, so everything's blocked off there. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Beautiful trees here and stuff. That's the Tay River ahead of us there. And yeah. Anyway, all this business with the Perth Fair lately has brought a couple of memories back um, that I hadn't thought about in a while. One of them's kind of comical in a way, although I didn't think it was funny at the time. The other one's kind of sad, really. I'll tell you the comical one first. When I was, I would say about 7 years old, a bunch of us went to the Perth Fair, and we were on the midway there, with all the rides and stuff. And one of my half sisters, I won't say who, but one of them talked me into going on the tilt-a-whirl. So we get on the tilt-a-whirl, and they start that thing up. Now, back in those days, safety was even less of a concern than it is now. Even now at carnivals, I don't really know how much they consider safety, but in those days, if they consider it at all nowadays, in those days they did not consider it at all. Safety was a totally foreign concept to people who ran carnivals, and just in general, even safety was kind of a foreign concept. Well, we didn't really think of safety. Nowadays, of course, everything's safe to the point where they take the fun out of it, but in those days it was the opposite, really. I mean, you could be killed doing pretty basic, mundane things that people these days take for granted, because safety was just that bad, or there was just a lack of safety, I suppose, in many respects. Anyway, when you get onto this tilt-a-whirl, anybody who's seen the tilt-a-whirl ride knows what it's like. They're usually painted red, and it's basically a big metal pod that you sit in, and the whole thing spins, but then the individual metal pods even will spin one way, and then they'll spin back the other way as the whole thing rotates. And of course it goes up and down too and stuff as it rotates. And anyway, get your blood circulated pretty well. But what happened was, in those days there was very little padding. There was a lot of steel and not very much padding. And they had a seat there that was like a leather or a naugahyde bench seat that you'd find in a car almost, back then. It was, so there, from your shoulders up, there was really no protection at all. And you're sitting on this thing, and what happened was every time the thing whipped around, it would just, the force of it, the centrifugal force of the thing would cause my head to whip around, and my head was bouncing off the wall of the thing anyway, the steel wall. I don't know how many hits to the head I took, but holy smokes, I was seeing stars before long. And anyway, it was just knocking me silly. Some would say I'm still pretty silly. Maybe that's how it started, I don't know, but anyway, yeah, it just beat my head in, that ride did. I come out of that thing there completely it was terrible. Anyway, looked like I'd gone 10 rounds with Muhammad Ali or something, It was really bad. But my head all beat in, staggering around and stuff. Just could barely walk. I was in terrible shape. Anyway, that was just one story. It's kind of comical to look back on now. It wasn't very funny at the time, but it was comical to look back on now. It's comical to think about now because, like 50 years have passed. So if you can't laugh at something after 50 years, well, Either it was a really serious thing that should never be laughed at, or you just maybe don't have a great sense of humor, one or the other, you know. But that's one story anyway from back in those times. You can hear a train coming through. There's train tracks over that way. But anyway, the other story though is a little bit sadder, and this goes back, kind of a sad story. This goes back to my taxi driving days. For there was a period of about 6 months back in 1990 where I must have lost my mind or whatever was left of it and decided it'd be a good idea to drive a taxi. I was wrong about that. It took me about 6 months to figure out how wrong I was because I'm kind of a slow learner. But anyway, I was wrong about that. Driving a taxi was not a good idea, but it did give me a few stories to tell anyway. That's one thing about it. I guess I'm sort of reaping the benefits of it now because of the experiences I had. You know, it kind of gave me some life experience and some stories to tell that I didn't already have. But anyway, this is again a story connected to the Perth Fair. I got called to the Perth Fair to pick up somebody and take them out to the Perth Plaza Motel, which is a motel out on Highway 7. So I go to the fairgrounds there. There's a carny there. You could tell he was a carny because he was very dirty going, and he was covered in tattoos, and he was rough looking, you know, and stuff. And this is the way carnies looked in those days. So you knew a carny when you saw one anyway. But he got into the car, and I took him over to the Perth Plaza Motel. I took him over to such and such a room. And was a particular specific room I was to take him to. Well, when I pulled into the yard there and parked in front of this room, the door opened up and a guy came out who was equally rough looking to the guy I was dropping off. And he got in the car. He said, "Take me to the fairgrounds." And so I did. The guy I dropped off went into the room. The guy that I had just come out of the room, I took him back to the fairgrounds. Anyway, this process repeated itself all day long. I'd take a guy from the fairgrounds out to the motel, and then somebody would come out of the room, another guy. They're all rough-looking characters. I'd pick him up. He'd get in the car. I'd take him back to the fairgrounds. Anyway, yeah. Well, one guy got in the car, and he was going on about the great experience he had just had, and going on about how wild this girl was. And oh man, he said, "You need to get yourself some of that." He said, "You're a fool if you don't get in there and get some of that, I'm telling you." And he went on and on about how great it was. I just said, "So I guess you had a good time." "Oh yeah." He said, "It was well worth the money. I'll tell you that. That girl is effing wild," he said. And he just went on and on about how great a time he had had with this girl in the room. Of course, I had figured out by that time anyway what was going on, you know. I figured there was a woman in there selling her services, you know, to the carnies. And so, like I say, there was no big surprise there. Anyway, I'll fast forward now to that night. That night, I got called out to the Perth Plaza Motel again. This time, it was to pick somebody up there. So I wasn't picking somebody up at the fairgrounds and dropping them off at the motel and then happened to catch somebody coming out of the room and bringing them back. That's not what it was. I was to go directly to the Perth Plaza Motel to pick somebody up. So I get out there anyway, and the girl, she come out of the room and she got into the car, and I drove her home. Now, here's the catch, though, to the whole thing. I knew the girl. I knew who she was. She'd been in my taxi before. And I knew quite a bit about her, actually, because I'd had conversations with her, and and I got along with her. The girl's name was Rebecca, and she was staying at a farm And I used to tease her. I used to call her Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Anyway, the thing about it is, though, this girl was a foster child that was basically this farm, the people who owned the farm took in foster children, and she was a foster child. And she was like 14 years old. And here she had been in that room all day long, you know, and I had been bringing these carnies out there, and like, anyway, that's the story there. She was just a 14-year-old girl, and foster child. And there's another angle to the story too, because a few years later, the farmer who owned that farm, it came out that he had been sexually molesting the foster children that he'd been keeping there. So there's another angle to the story anyway that isn't so great. But anyway, that's a couple of stories, I guess, connected to the Perth Fair. Oh, I'll tell you one last story. Well, I've got you here. I'll tell you one last story connected to the fair. This one's actually kind of good. This isn't really my story so much as my father's story, my dad's story. And somebody told me this story years after my dad passed away. Somebody told me this story because this person was one of the ones who benefited from what my dad had done. But I'll tell the story anyway. There was a game there, you know, how the hucksters have their games there, and you can win stuffed animals and other junk like that. And we all know that those games are pretty well rigged, that it's not, you know, it's next to impossible to win them, really. But anyway, it was the game where you throw the softball into the apple basket, into one of those bushel baskets, you know. Of course, the way they have it set up, it's pretty much impossible for the ball has to stay in the basket. Like if you throw the ball into the basket and it bounces out, that doesn't count. And they have it set up in such a way that it's almost impossible not to have the ball bounce out. They just have the basket at just the right angle and stuff that, you know, you really can't do it generally, or it's very difficult. Well, my dad, he managed to do it. He managed to be able to throw the ball into the basket in just such a way that it would stay in the basket. And so he was winning prizes. And what happened is kids started to line up, and they were giving my dad their money to play the game for them. He'd throw the ball for them, and he'd win them a prize. Well, the carney that was running the game, he got mad because he was losing a lot of prizes, you know. That wasn't supposed to happen. So he was pretty upset with my dad, and he told my dad, he said, "You can't play anymore. I'm cutting you off." And my dad said, "No," he said, "you can't do that." Now, my dad was a teenager at the time. He'd have been maybe 15, 16 years old. This was in the early 1950s. This was around 1952, 53 in there. Anyway, there was always a cop wandering around in the fairgrounds when the fair was on, you know, in case of any trouble, in case a fight broke out or whatever, you know, there was always a cop there. And anyway, the guy cut my dad off. He said, "You can't play the game anymore." And so my dad, he went and he got the policeman that was wandering around, told him the story, and the policeman came over and he had a good look at the game and determined that it was in fact rigged, and he shut it down. So the guy got shut, the carney got shut down anyway for running a rigged game. Now, really, I mean, they were all rigged. Really, it was pretty common knowledge that they were all rigged. But because he cut my dad off, and my dad had gone and told on him, basically the game got shut down. So it put him right out of business anyway, is what it did. But he was going to be out of business anyway, I guess, though, if my dad kept winning for everybody. But he just figured out just the right way to throw the ball so that the ball wouldn't bounce back out of the basket. And the thing is, the person who told me that story was one of the kids that my dad had won a stuffed animal for. When he was playing the game, he was one of the ones that had given my dad his money, and my dad had played for him, and won him this stuffed animal. So anyway, so this person, anyway, they told me that story. This was, like I say, this was years after my dad passed away. I was told this story. Anyway, that's it. There's a 3 stories, it turns out. 2 stories plus a bonus story, I guess, from the Perth Fair. Yeah. Actually, you know what? I've got a 4th one. I'm sitting here thinking I got a 4th one. I'll tell you this one, too. When I was a kid, we didn't get a whole lot of extras, candy and pop and all that, sugar stuff. We didn't get a lot of that back then. It was probably a good thing, really. We were probably far healthier because of it. But still, when you got something like that, it was kind of a big deal. And one of my big things was when the fair came, I had to get the cotton candy. That was the only time I ever got cotton candy, is when the fair came. And so, anyway, I wanted cotton candy. That was always a big thing. It cost a dime back then for a cone of cotton candy. So, anyway, I go to the fair. I guess I had been about 6 or 7 years old. I go to the fair. Of course, I've got my dime there. I'm going to get some cotton candy. And I buy a cone of cotton candy. And, back then, you got quite a bit, for your money back then. It wasn't like now where they charge the shit out of you and they give you next to nothing. Back then, you paid your money. You got good value for your money. With most things you did, anyway. And anyway, so I get this great big friggin' wad of cotton candy on a cardboard cone, The thing was as big as my head. And of course, you take your fingers and you pick some off and put it in your mouth, and it's real good, It just melts in your mouth, and it's wonderful, really. It's really quite an experience. Well, I paid my dime. The guy handed me my big cone of cotton candy. I picked one piece off it and put it in my mouth, and I turned around to walk away, and there was a big 45-gallon tin drum there right at the corner of this booth that was for garbage, Well, a great big friggin' hornet hovered up out of the thing just like a helicopter. Up he come. And what did he do? He went straight into my cotton candy, disappeared into my cotton candy. So that was it anyway. There was no cotton candy for me. Anyway, I remember I was awful disappointed about that. But that's another story. Anyway, I just took and threw the cotton candy into the garbage drum there, into the garbage can that the hornet had come out of. So I'm guessing the hornet and his buddies had a good feast anyway on my cotton candy, but oh well. That's just another story anyway from the Perth Fair. Anyway, that's it for now. We'll talk to y'all later.